Today's digital lab, we have two of my very good friends and partners in ministry. We have Vinnie Fisher. Vinnie is the CEO and co-founder of Fully Accountable, which is an accounting and consulting company that has taken off in recent years. They've only been around for 5 years, and yet God's blessing them, and they're doing great things. But prior to that, starting that company, Vinnie is a lawyer by trade, and he's provided general counsel for Grace Church of Greater Akron, as well as other churches. He wears a lot of hats, but God has used him in some incredible ways. Even in my life and in my time as a pastor, he's helped us out of some tricky jams. So we've invited Vinnie to be on this call today as our expert. And Esther would want to say that she is less of an expert, but Esther Pacheco is with us today, and she is still an expert in counseling world, as she is a licensed and professional counselor. Esther lives in Delaware, Ohio, with her husband, who is the lead pastor at Grace Church in Delaware, and together they have been on staff at Momentum and helped in a lot of ways with Momentum Youth Conference. So I know Vinnie is no stranger to Momentum, as well as he serves with the Bath campus and a lot of the students there. So we're excited to have you guys on today. Thank you both for joining. We're pumped to continue a conversation that the three of us have had for several years here. So anything I missed just on your bio?
No, hey, thanks for having us, Eric. I'll let Esther speak for herself, but if I'm speaking for both of us, which I tend to do sometimes, thanks for making this. I know the three of us have been dreaming about how can we come alongside our fellow youth staff and workers and volunteers and the church as a whole to equip. You know, the church historically has been lean on resources, on counseling and legal and compliance, and rightfully so, right? Like we need to put our resources into other places. And so as we continue to get, I guess, ever added requirements in this area about child abuse, specifically even sexual abuse as it relates to children, I think it's wonderful that we've created some space to help our sister churches.
Yeah, Esther, anything you want to add? Even kind of what's your role with Momentum Youth Conference from year to year?
For the last few years, Momentum has asked me to come and kind of help guide youth workers through those sticky situations when a kid brings up something related to mental health and the youth worker's not quite sure what to do about it. They often come to me to help them figure out what the game plan is, what their response can be, and what's the best action that we should take to help get the help that every kid needs.
Yeah, well, our goal for this conversation today and our digital lab is really targeted at churches. So if you're a pastor, a youth pastor, if you're watching this and you are not any of those things, please pass this video on to your pastor, your church leaders, because this conversation is really so vital. It's so important for us to be having. It's the idea of when worst case scenario hits in your church, which if you're not prepared for it, I was a pastor for 17 years. There were situations in our youth ministry, in our church, circumstances that arise that you need to be prepared for. And so our goal today is to make sure that you as a church, that your ministry is prepared for tragedy and that you have the right systems in place for when that worst case scenario strikes. So that's what we want to help you with today. Vinnie and Esther are going to be insanely helpful in that process and thinking through what do those policies, procedures look like. So let's dive in. Let's kind of I just wanted to share briefly kind of how this conversation came about for us. So 3 years ago, I was a youth pastor in Frederick, Maryland, was taking some students to Momentum Youth Conference, and Esther, exactly what you just said happened in our youth ministry. We had a student who raised an issue. There were things questions that we had as she told our youth volunteer about what was going on. Our youth volunteer was a college intern, and she had no clue what to do. So she brought it to me as the youth pastor. I said, I don't know what to do either. Let's get some help. So we contacted Esther, and through the channels of Momentum Youth Conference, I rejoice and praise God that there were systems and policies in place there. We were able to get connected then with Vinnie, and Vinnie helped walk us through as a church the issues of reporting, getting the parents involved. How do we follow the policies and procedures that needed to take place? And I praise God because that whole circumstance and situation worked to the best possible scenario. And so that really was to the aid of both of you walking me through that as a youth pastor. And because of that, we've since said, hey, these are things that we should be talking about in churches to help understand what are the privileges that we hold as paid employees of the church, as volunteers. And so that's really the conversation that we want to continue today in engaging. So Vinnie, why don't you just kind of explain your recommended process, your thoughts on reporting, and even, harken back a little bit to that conversation that we started a couple years ago at Youth Conference.
All right, I appreciate that. And let me frame a couple things. So this will be recorded for you. So you have the recording. So I would encourage you to engage, to listen. And if you have any questions, put them into either our comment filter or our chat, and we'll run them into the right people to get their hands on. And then finally, we have resources. We want to share those with you and get them. So reach out to Eric and his team, and we'll get you that stuff, because we want to be your ministry partner and get you these things so that you're best equipped. But let me start you with this. This is an awful scenario every time. I'm not going to make light of it. It is never fun when you hear about a fellow kid at church, a woman many times, a young lady who's been violated. It's awful. I'm not trying to make light of it when we sit here and talk in a corporate sense about it. So please trust our hearts on that. We're here to help you and how to deal with it. Situations are unique. They have all kinds of things attached to them. They're painful. And I'm sorry, it's not an if, it's a when your organization goes through it. So we decided a number of years ago, the three of us, let's do what we can to help equip our fellow ministry partners and not try to avoid this situation. So I want you to think of one thing. The whole theme here, we have 3 or 4 actors. We have volunteers that work within our ministry. We have people who are on staff, paid or not paid, lots of times paid. And then we have executive members of that staff who serve in that overarching thing. There's a chain of command. A church acts no differently than any other organization. There is a true chain of command. And so what I want the general theme of my advice to be remembered for you is I want you to know one thing, and you're going to hear me say it over and over and over. You think up, not out. Volunteer, paid or unpaid staff, chain of command. Our reporting in all cases goes up, not out. Ultimately, out comes at the end of the chain of command. Now, each church runs a little differently in how their chain of command works. But what our experience is that almost every church, whether it has an elder board or not, has a senior pastor. So what our advice is that up ultimately runs to the senior pastor. Now, there's ways, and what I want to start you with is we have something unique that many things don't have. So what do we have that's different than schools? What do we have that's different than community centers? We are required to maintain privilege. Churches sometimes forget that we have, I'm a lawyer, so I can appreciate this, under each state law, a pastoral privilege and the legal requirement of privilege are some of the most protected privileges dating back to St. Augustine's establishment of this idea of privilege. And some could argue it even predates the actual legal requirement of that. But we have privilege. Why am I using that as the basis of our discussion? Because up, not out is critical in maintaining pastoral privilege. I know what flag you have going on in your mind. You're thinking to yourself, oh, wait a minute. If I'm a volunteer, I don't have privilege. Yes, he or she does, because she is working or he is at the direct extension of that paid staff worker who's also at the direct extension of a pastor on staff, who's also at the direct extension of the senior pastor, who also works at the direct advisement and consent of the elder board. So that chain of command is a real thing. And so what we do to protect pastoral privilege is critical. What we have running up against us in every state and every law, a good thing is what is the best interest of the child. So right now we've been home. We have tough times. Churches aren't meeting. Some are meeting virtually. Some aren't meeting at all. We have a lot of our youth programs being suspended because of working through what are our best practices. Well, there's one thing I can tell you for sure, that through economic corrections, hardships, depression, the economically corrections, us being closed, you could do a very simple Google search to see that abuse is on the rise. When we start meeting, we have the wonderful burden and privilege of leading our kids again. This is not an if, it's a when. We are going to have real cases of abuse and neglect on our doorstep. And so that's a real thing. And what I want to hope to encourage you is how to think about up, not out. So take a deep breath. That's a real thing. I'm not going to make light of it. We have got plenty of scenarios that we can give you and in Q&A. And so what I want to talk about, my thing I want to needle on is the volunteer. That's a critical component to our church. You could not do effective expansion in ministry without awesome brothers and sisters in Christ who come from the volunteer sector at church. Interestingly, some of our best volunteers are teachers, clinicians, guidance counselors, moms. Now, I picked on those three because those three are typically them who get the most reporting of sexual abuse. Here's some real working facts. Sexual abuse is a real thing to both young men and young women, children, young children. The number one place that it's reported, by the way, the number one place abuse happens, as Esther will tell you, is in the home. Abuse happens with family, right, relatives. Far and away the number one statistic. The number one place that it's reported historically is at school, to teachers, maybe even guidance counselors. Those people do not have a position of privilege that's protected under state laws. So you'll see state laws that say that person is required to report incidents of abuse. And you'll see things where you're being trained on being reporting of that. When you or one of your volunteers who sits in those types of situations come and serve on your team as a volunteer, he or she needs to park that role. They're not there in a capacity as a teacher, a guidance counselor, or clinician, or counselor. With or without that hat, which is very hard to shut up, they sit under the chain of command on your youth staff. So they should never, and I mean never, be the one who's reporting a situation to the proper authorities. It needs to come from the chain of command. They're not hearing this counseling at their church. Moms are not hearing this because they're moms. Moms are never going to stop being the most amazing people on the planet who are always wanting to protect these young people. But they don't run to the police. They run to their youth paid worker who then brings it through privilege. Important fact to know. We're not going to spend time today on what are the elements of privilege. I don't want volunteers or youth people kind of making sure whether or not something privileged. I want you to err on the caution of side that it is privileged. And we move up. And what I mean by moving up is not lateral. You don't go tell another volunteer. You need to get into the chain of command. You don't go find your friend who might have slept at a Holiday Inn and get his or her advice. You have to go up to your chain of command. It's important because we are trying to protect the sanctity of this child feeling safe to report correctly. She, in most cases, took a courageous step in telling you. The worst thing we could do to validate or support that courageous step is go in the wrong direction. One, a lawyer in me wants to say, creating exposure to the church body. Two, we're really leaving that child in an unsafe place because we would have now put it in a wrong context. That's real important. I want your team to know from you that it's up, not out, because you're trying to keep that child in a safe place. Because what we've learned in youth group over the years is that an unruly child might be acting out. There may not be a reporting requirement. But in most cases, we take the fact that we have one. We just run it through the right system and love her through the process. 2, you do not know if you are actually reporting correctly because it may be a historical situation you're dealing with versus an active thing going on in the home. And 3, the second most reported place that happens is where the child has already told the mother about the situation going on in the home. And because the bad actor is the breadwinner, they don't want to report. So our job is to come along as the pastoral privileged party is to help mom through that process. It's not our job to actually circumvent inside the family. We have a interesting role there. And I recognize it's complicated, which is why we move it up the ladder. Does that make sense, everybody? So I want to take a break there. I think there's other things that require in, but I feel like that introduction was critical to this discussion.
Yeah. So Vinnie, as you're explaining that, right, I'm putting my youth pastor hat on.
Yep.
I'm thinking, okay, if I'm a youth pastor, then I must have these conversations with all of my volunteers and explain to them exactly what you're saying. That's what you're recommending.
Absolutely.
And not even just on a youth pastor level, every church staff, every lead pastor should be having these conversations with their youth pastors, with their paid staff, to know the process, the policies that we're putting in place.
Yeah, so I've served as the general counsel of the Grace Church, Bath campus, and all of our campuses that sit under our kind of 30 and 30 campaign. And every year-ish, we try to make sure that the executive management people, all the pastors, are together for kind of like a retreat. And at that retreat, I will talk about privilege and what its importance are. And then each of our departments, and specifically family ministries as it relates to youth, we have one every year where we're giving this talk. So absolutely. And we can give you those resources. Just ask, raise your hand. We will, Jim and our team and our campus are happy to share those. And I would delightfully make Eric as busy as you want him to be sharing this information. But I want you as the leader to meet with your people and actually keep a very simple and clear directive to your volunteers to take all the pressure off them to have to navigate what they're supposed to do. They need to come running to you. They don't need to figure out whether they're the pastor. They don't need to figure out whether they're a qualified counselor. They need to know to bring it to you. And then you have to understand and equip that you don't have to figure it all out. You have a report above you. Ultimately, we want landing on the senior pastor's lap these tough issues, because we don't want the senior pastor getting a call from the police detective hearing that Esther decided to call, and now we want to know, and we don't want the reporter of the local community to come in and say, hey, Jeff, what's your opinion on this? Not a scenario that we ever want with privilege. And not because we aren't taking it seriously, it's because we are taking it seriously.
Well, because, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of other factors, and you mentioned some of them, but anyone who's been in ministry for any length of time, the complicatedness that this can lead into real quickly. And so it really is having the best interest in mind for that child, especially with what may be going on at home that we don't know about. And so report up before reporting out, right?
And I can't tell you how many times, Eric, and Esther can speak to this, where people in wonderfully good-hearted fellow sisters and brothers in Christ go and report, and then new facts arrive, and they're like, oh, I thought I was doing the right thing, and then they feel awful because they thought they were doing the right thing, when in reality, it's just about the exact opposite thing they should have done.
So Vinnie and maybe Esther kind of chime in here. When we're dealing with students, right, teens, children, Vinnie, you mentioned family ministries. How do we know what things need to be held in confidence and what things need to be shared with parents. Now, this is kind of a trick question or a loaded question, but I'm trying now to think like maybe one of our viewers. So walk us through that. Esther,
Yeah, let's start with the premise of privilege, okay?
Yeah.
And so, here's one little thing I need to let you know. As if it's a minor, we're talking to a minor for all of you, everyone under the age of majority. Now, I recognize that there's a complication with, can someone sexually consent to certain things at 16 or 17 or 18? But under the age of majority in every state, we're talking about the age of 18. The factual considerations of why something might be consent in a younger age, let's just park that for a second. We're talking under the age of 18 is a minor. Well, our relationship to that person, the privilege is actually, I know this sounds tough, to the parent. The legal and natural guardian holds that privilege, not the child. Now, I want you to remember something. We would have awful ministries. I serve as a youth worker in our ministries. Every year, spend a week at Momentum, unfortunately not this year, and love doing it. We have a counseling role to minors. We have this balancing act where we have to accept hearing information about one of our kids smoking weed, and at the same time, like, keeping some of that confidence as not running back to mom and dad. Like, welcome to the beauty of counseling children. We have to delicately be the workers and pastors to youth where we start running into these issues that start to run against our obligation to run back to either the natural guardian authority, the legal guardian authority, or above them to legal issues. Reporting up. Don't make that decision on your own. You need to run it to the flagpole. If you're not sure whether or not some kid just told you about that bad night that their stepdad did something, you don't try to make that decision. You go right up to the reporting staff that you need to know. You need to tell your people, don't guess. You don't need to guess. But at the end of the day, I want everyone to remember, we're counselors to minors. If we don't find a delicate balance between quickly reporting, we're going to lose the general ability to be good counselors to minors. We have to weigh that very delicately. And that burden's real, and we're in it with you, but that privilege is to the parent. When do we trigger it? When do we not? Man, it gets complicated. And Eric, your question's really hard. And I'd say that the more complicated, the more we need to be involved. Good wisdom from the people that we have delegated their authority down to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a common question. This is one that I had in youth ministry. This is one that we will get. I'm a small group leader. A student confesses they're involved in pornography. Do I tell the youth pastor and break the confidence of the student? What do you guys say on that?
Esther, I'll let you jump first. I have a youth-to-youth opinion, but I really love to hear Esther jump on that.
My biggest thing is sometimes we can lose sight of the kids. Like, as adults, we can sometimes come in and just start making decisions and go with it, and we forget to have a conversation with the child about, well, what do you want to do about it? And really listen and hear what they want to do about it, what they think we should do about it. That doesn't mean that's what we're going to do about it, but we need to make sure that we're listening to them, hearing from them. And you never know, they might know exactly what they need to do, and they end up taking care of it themselves and doing the things that they need to do it. But they want you to be there to help support them and do that. And if we don't ask them, we never know whether they know what's going on. We need to be careful. We don't rush in to fix a kid's problem. We always give them a chance to do it on their own. Where we come in, where we need to do something, is when we're finding they're not. Like, they are stuck. They don't know how to get out of it, what to do, or they don't want to get out of it. And at that moment in time, we got to start having conversations with them and making sure they know what we're going to do. Kids can sniff out incongruence in an adult in a split second, and they will like hightail it out of there if they think that you are not being truthful with them. And you got to make sure that you're truthful with them and they know what's going to happen and what's expected. And even letting them know, hey, this is what you've expressed to me. This is where I see you're at. This is my next step. And what do you think about that? And always keeping them in the loop.
Yeah, I think I love that answer. And I would add to it that, if we're going to be seen as a counselor, whether we're a volunteer or not, we're in a pastoral relationship with a young person. And if they believe that our job is to be basically an emissary for the parent, and which means it's like we're just going to run back and tell them everything, then our counseling is going to be highly ineffective. I was recently, some of you all might know my buddy Brad Creek, who's in charge of our family ministry. And we were just talking about this recently, that like we're first and foremost pastors and counselors to youth. And so we got to give them room to be able to share the stumblings and the things that they're doing. And is really the idea that they're in pornography something that rises to the level of bringing a parent involved? Now, I think in age maturity and stuff, like we're there counseling them. This idea that we're going to be running back to their parents, hey, mom and dad, if you're listening and you're watching, it's like, I want to know everything. Well, I'm going to tell you, as a youth volunteer who serves under the full faith and credit of Brad and our family ministries, that's not going to happen. We're there loving them, and we're going to walk them through drawing into unity with Christ, not into making sure that mom and dad know everything that's going on in their life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think even as a youth pastor in my time there, like I would always coach and encourage our youth volunteers, never promise that the students that you're going to keep something in confidence, because you may not know what it is.
Yeah.
So Vinnie, you're exactly right. There may be sin issues that aren't life or death, life-threatening situations that mom and dad may not need to be involved in, and we can walk through spiritual maturity and obedience. And there have been times where I then, as the youth pastor, Esther, per the student's request, will go and have that conversation with mom and dad, because the kid's like, they're going to kill me if I tell them this. And I'm like, no, they're not. Your parents love you. I know your parents. It's going to be okay. But you go with them rather than I'm going to make the choice for you. I
would say totally. The one thing I think people are probably thinking about watching this right now is, what if we're in the middle of a sin issue and all of a sudden something else happens? What do I do? I would encourage you, in case you weren't clear in your relationship and your friendship with that person. I'm thinking about a young man in my life who was in my particular group, and he was sharing about pornography and his thing. And quickly in the conversation, he started sharing some family bad issues that happened to him. Mm-hmm. And I was like, hey, bud, I want to be real clear. Like, I need you to keep sharing with me. But we ever got to a point where something's happening to you, my job's also to help protect you. Like, I might be getting others involved. And like, don't ever be afraid to hit the pause button if it switches from counseling them through how to go deal with mom and dad and bring into the light your stumbling and sin, versus all of a sudden now I've got a legal obligation to maybe identify and protect you.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead and repeat that. Like, don't be afraid to stop them and say, I love you. Listen, don't not tell me. I'm here to help you. I promise not, but we might need to get someone else involved.
Yeah. So Esther, oftentimes in churches, again, speaking from experience as a pastor, I may not have a background in counseling. I may not know how to walk through all of those things. So how would you recommend local churches work together with local counseling companies and organizations that can help do what they do best, where then the church can kind of walk through that spiritual discipleship obedience path? What does that look like?
Well, I absolutely think that every pastor should have a handful of counselors on a referral list. And I would highly suggest it to be a handful, because you're going to need a few different types of counselors to be able to handle a few different types of people. Some people need some different kinds of counselors and need something different from each counselor. And so definitely. And then I would pick up the phone and have a conversation, interview those counselors to make sure that they're in line with kind of what you're thinking, and even getting an idea to make sure that they're in line with how this person from your church you're referring to make sure that it's possibly a good match. But definitely do not be afraid to call a counselor and ask them some questions. Hey, because we love referral sources, and if we'll have a conversation with anybody who's going to be willing to funnel us some clients, and so we will most definitely have that conversation. And this is definitely important too if you're in an area in which you're not quite sure who these people are. Some of them may not have like strong Christian backgrounds, and I want to encourage you that still might work out. Because as a licensed professional in counseling, I am technically not necessarily allowed to be a Christian. I am to encourage whatever faith of that person that comes in my door, and I'm not allowed to discourage it. And science shows that to have a faith and to believe in something greater than ourselves definitely increases our client's outcome of healing. And so for a counselor to come in and discredit that would be awful. So have those conversations. Even if they're not professing Christians, you still might find them to be amazing counselors. And if they are those amazing counselors, they will absolutely encourage your congregation that you refer to them in their faith as they pursue God.
Yeah.
And I would add, that's so good. I would add that pastors, you need to develop a kind of like a muscle for like your brain on like alerts things like where it's outside your expertise. There are just things that licensed counselors are more equipped to deal with when it comes to mental disorder and disease and hardship. And there's things that, not to say you can't, some of you may be great at handling it, but I think that Rolodex of pick up the phone, the only caution I would give you is you need to talk in fact pattern, not people specifics. You have a privilege to protect. So if you're looking for advice and friendship in a Rolodex, then speak in general fact patterns, the way Eric, Esther, and I speak about things. Now, I'm in a little bit different situation as a lawyer, so they can make sure that there's not a destroying of the privilege, but that's not always true. So be very careful, pastor, when you're speaking with your Rolodex, always fact pattern. If the counselor ends up having an engagement with the penitent, I always love the word sinner, it's a great one, but with the client, then that can be a way to broach through that and then maybe partner up. And at that point, though, you may have handed off some of that relationship, and you got to be okay with them having an independent relationship as well, which is why, listen to what Esther's advice was. Know who you're giving your kid off to, because you might be undoing some stuff otherwise you didn't want to have that be part of that counseling session.
Yeah. So what would be some other resources that might be available? Because we know of churches that are in our network and in the Charis Fellowship that may live in communities where there aren't a lot of counseling companies or resources within their local community that they can engage with and involve. So Esther, maybe what would other options be, resources or national organizations that you might recommend using, if there are any?
I'm not exactly sure how many like national resources, but right now, especially with this whole, like all of us counselors had to move to telehealth, and we have all gotten really good at it. And so the reality is proximity is no longer something that gets in the way of counseling. And so if you are in a small podunk town and there's just not counselors in your area, call the next biggest city, call around and find out and talk with them and find out what counselors are interested in being able to do that for you.
And I would add, like, because of telemedicine and because of this thing called the Google, there's more access even in smaller places than people might first think. Like, there are good, God-fearing people that want to help. Usually the thing it's not access to good people. It's usually situations where can someone actually pay or afford to get access to it. And so our church does things like an agape fund and some other things where we come along and help. And so I would say that sometimes it's afraid to ask. So what can we do as the pastors have a small network of people we know, because they're there, they really are there. the world's gotten a lot smaller in this sense. And so raise your hand. Call Esther. She certainly could help you think about a place to look. And there are like resources, but there's probably more. Like I think about my wife who's from a little podunk town, Punxsutawney. Like if they just look, sorry, honey, it's true. But if you just look, the reality is there are people that are available. I think sometimes it comes into a financial situation.
Mm-hmm. And Esther, I think I like even what you're saying. Like in my years in Frederick, Maryland, that was absolutely the case because there's a different criteria that things need to filter through. And so it may be a financial ramification. So that meant I knew to call this company because they did things that were on a prorated scale or for pro bono work or whatever. And so that helps to know if you don't have those. Vinny's calling it the Rolodex. If you don't have that in your pocket, then you're stuck and it may get delayed in the process when maybe you're the lead pastor and you need to move quickly on that.
Yeah. And I would say as a litmus test, I love litmus tests of self-awareness. If you hear this and you don't have a small Rolodex now, then you're practicing hoping it never happens instead of when it will happen. So I would encourage you to hear this as a exhortation, an encouragement to go pick up the phone and start meeting some counsels in your area.
Yeah. So Vinny, I love that because I want to turn the corner here in our conversation, but I also want to remind our viewers, if you're watching this live and you have any questions, whether you're on Facebook or in the webinar, drop them in the comment box or in our Q&A box here. We'd love to answer those. But Vinny, on exactly what you were just saying, okay, if you're a pastor, you're a leader, and you're listening and you're thinking, I don't have that, let's get it in place. Let's get those things put in place. But Vinny, what would be things that every church should make sure that they have in place now so that they're prepared when, like you said, not if, but when that worst case scenario happens?
So this up, not out training, and we have parts of it that Jim and Eric, you guys can, at CE, we have these resources. I would do that training. 2, I would have everyone, all the way down to volunteers, sign off on the little sheet that we've created that they participated in that. 3, nobody should be working with your children unless they've been through a background check. You no longer live in an environment where you can say, oops, I'm sorry. That's just how it goes. Oh, it's expensive. Well, guess what? There are resources and ways where ask Eric and his team. There's ways to pull that up as most cost effective as possible. So those 3 things. And then I would say that if your church doesn't have some of this in place, bring it to the attention of your senior pastor.
Yep. Yeah. Esther, anything you'd add on that?
I think my biggest advice is we've got to make sure as youth workers, as pastors, as ministry workers, we've got to be making sure that we're taking care of our own mental health in this, because if we're not taking care of our own mental health and making sure that we're emotionally healthy, mentally healthy, we can't be available and do the things that our kids need us to do, because we don't want to freak out because what they're telling us is bringing up our own stuff. And then we're not quite sure, are we reacting to these kids this way because it's our stuff that's coming to the surface, or are we reacting to it because of what the kids are saying? And so it's super important that you guys are managing your own stress. You guys are eating well, exercising, and sleeping. Like those are 4 main key components that we all need to be doing to maintain and keep ourselves healthy.
And I would say, like, to add to that, like, stay united and in unity with the Lord and the Word. Like, literally, like, if I think, Esther just exposed some of the counseling for me. That was telling on me, by the way, she just did. But no, seriously, like, if we aren't on a firm foundation, all of a sudden we're going to be counseling ourselves through our kids. And it's extremely unhealthy. And so that's such good counsel. If you heard nothing else, like where you sit in abiding in unity with Christ is going to directly flow into your ministry.
And I think being proactive rather than reactive is really what we're saying in a lot of this. Like, if there are things that God's bringing to your mind in this conversation that you're wrestling with, then be proactive in them rather than sitting around waiting for something to happen, because it's going to multiply from there. And then you make bad decisions because now you're stressed, and it compounds quickly.
Yeah, and call Eric and his team. Again, speaking fact patterns. We do this in our own church too. Like when Jim or any, we speak fact pattern first, not just because we're trying to be legal and protect privilege, but we're also trying to protect that person. Mm-hmm. You can give good advice without actually filling in the details, right? And so we try to protect that person. But the reality is you're not alone. I recognize you might be at a small church and you might not have many resources around you, but you have Eric and his team. And they'll find you the right resource. So if you feel alone, call him. Like, he's not working hard enough as it is anyway. So hit him up. Like, he needs to work more. So like, we want to help.
Absolutely. Absolutely we do. And that's exactly why this whole digital lab exists. Why we started these, because we want to train and equip workers, believers, to be on mission for Christ. And so we know from being in ministry for any length of time that these are things that are going to happen. And so, Vinnie, Esther, I cannot thank you guys enough for being a part of this conversation today. I hope it will continue. I hope that we get to do training and equipping with other churches in these areas, even because of this time that we've spent talking about this today. So if there are any questions, it doesn't look like there are any coming in from Facebook. So anything else you guys want to add? We're running out of time here.
No, I just love the fact that, we in all of our vibrant ministries, we're doing the work of the kingdom, and this stuff's hard. I'll tell you, there's a reason why the average tenure of a youth worker is very low, and I don't even want to share those numbers because I want you to be there longer, but it's hard. This is the front lines, and we love all you guys, and we're in it with you. We are in it. We work in youth groups. We're not just yelling at you, even though it might sound like we are. We're in this together with you, and we are about to enter a part of the mission field that hasn't looked like this in a while, and so just know we're in it with you.
Yeah. Well, Esther, would you just be willing to close us in prayer and pray for our viewers and any things that maybe God's putting on their heart they need to be obedient to?
Okay. Dear Father, I just thank you so much just for the time that we could come together and just learn from each other. And this is hard times that we're going through right now, times that we have never gone through before, as we're not as active in these kids' lives, that, Lord, you give us those opportunities to have some good conversation, be able to provide them a place that they belong and they can find significance as they learn to find that significance in you. I thank you so much just for the wisdom of all the people that are part of this phone call and their heart to equip ministry workers. And I just pray for those ministry workers out there as they are working hard and loving you and loving those kids. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.